Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to another HRO Today educational podcast. I'm Elliot Clark, the CEO of HRO Today. We publish HR Today Magazine, HRO Today EMEA, and HRO Today APAC. We're the hosts of the HRO Today forums and educational events held around the world, and we're the managers of the HRO Today Association. Today, we're going to be talking about remote work, and certainly we've all talked about remote work a great deal. But we're going to talk about remote work and its aspect that most people are not thinking about, and we have research to prove this. When you are hiring people as remote employees in other states, what are the impacts, legal compliance requirements of state-by-state recruiting, and specifically background screening and checking? And I'm thrilled to have a phenomenal guest to share some information, and they sponsored the research. Brandon Phillips is the founder and chief revenue officer of Global HR Research. He is responsible for developing and implementing the corporate growth strategies, managing overall operations and resources, overseeing the sales and marketing strategy, and he really has been guiding the growth from numerous projects. He's been recognized as a top 40, under 40 entrepreneurial success, and he has been responsible for GHRR since he developed the concept after recognizing the need for better security in corporate human resources. Brandon founded GHRR. I will mention that Global HR Research is actually one of the most highly rated companies on our HRO Today magazine Baker's Dozen customer satisfaction rankings for pre-employment screening. So Brandon, welcome to the podcast.
Elliot, thanks for having me, and certainly look forward to sharing some of my thoughts on this contingent workforce and sort of the impact that that COVID and sort of the current hiring situation all of the employers are faced with. And thanks so much for having me.
So Brandon, I know GHRR, you're one of the largest background screening companies in the world. You are the provider of these services to a number of Fortune 500 companies. And one of the questions you came in and asked us was, do we know how companies are adapting their model for background screening? It was a question you asked our research department with respect to in the wake of the global pandemic, in the wake of going to remote and hybrid work. And we went out and did the study, which is available on hrtoday.com in the research section, in the leadership section. And we found they're not. Like 60% of the respondents said there's no difference in the way they screen on premises versus remote. And another, only 27% thought their technology was any good. And we'll get to that in a moment. So what do companies need to know? Like, for example, if you're hiring somebody who is going to work remotely in Montana for a company based in California, which state's laws are precedent, or do you have to respect both of them? What do companies need to understand, and how do they need to get these answers?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a question we get faced with a lot as we are embarking upon new prospects, larger employers, and certainly the employers that have both the high volume of the independent contractors versus employees. And you also see a disparate amount of independent contractors today than pre-COVID, because of the reorganization of many corporations and just their entire workforce. So, when we get posed with this question, and your research actually helped us a lot understand sort of what they're doing, but, from a legal and compliance perspective, it really starts there, where if you think about the Fair Credit Reporting Act and how it is deployed across the country and how general counsels and compliance departments within the Fortune 500 or even smaller organizations look at it, independent contractors need to be treated very similarly to the employee. However, they are not the same. So you think about layering the Fair Credit Reporting Act, then you have the fact that there's state legislation that in some cases can augment what the FCRA says. So it's important to make sure that you have policies for both the independent contractor as well as for the employer and the employee, and they need to correlate, meaning they need to treat one another in similar fashion with regard to the screening. So if you have high-risk roles, if you have roles that are regulated, whether it be healthcare or whether it be transportation or financial services, the actual screening requirements need to be quite similar and defensible, showing that you're treating them almost like an employee. But the policy needs to read differently for that contractor versus the employee themselves or the candidates applying for a full-time position. This is one aspect of it. The challenge comes in when you actually deploy that policy through the technology and the technology providers, the background screening providers. Do they have the capability of actually being able to support that? Because you should be looking at the employees in one fashion. You should be looking at the independent contractors in another. Although those screening requirements need to be similar, you should have those divided within the technology. And in some cases, some of the technology in the industry don't really have the ability to support that. The final piece I'll say is that there's this layering effect of the legislation within the technology. So how do I respond to a state legislation that says I have to do a fingerprint in one state versus another, or I have to do a statewide criminal check in one state? In other states, it may not have that same requirement. Healthcare is a great example. And how do I do it so that the system actually takes care of the compliance aspect for me in some ways? And by that, I mean, does the mobile experience the candidate goes through, is it smart enough to know where the candidate is either living or where they're applying for a job? Does it populate the correct forms electronically? Or does a candidate have to go through pages and pages and pages of unnecessary information that could be a liability for the employer? So in summary, I think, on a high level, there has to be policy. There has to be technology that's smart enough to configure, especially at a high volume. Right? If you're a Fortune 500 company, you're hiring 5, 10, 20, up to 50,000 people or more a year. And you have to make sure the technology is robust enough to support all those considerations. And actually, your research said that folks are aware, employers are aware that they need better solutions. And what we're also finding is that some of the solutions simply aren't up to par, whether that's the legal capabilities or features within the system, the compliance features within the system, or the ability to manage this, sort of 50 state regulations that you have to be aware of when conducting background checks.
Well, you're raising a couple of interesting points and expanding on the question, because really companies that you're hiring permanent employees, that you should be screening them sort of the same way. You're also hiring people who are contingent labor, independent contractors who will have access to your network, your resources, your intellectual property via their admittance to your network. And, do companies really think through the nuances of what the different approaches should be for each one of those constituencies? Or do you see more often when you arrive with a new client that they try to have this one size fits all approach, even though they're vastly different categories? People in your building, permanent employees out of your building, independent contractors who may only work for you for 18 months.
Yeah, we definitely do. I mean, and every company is a little bit different, but we see that generally the policies are underdeveloped when it comes to treating them different. They do sort of have one universal approach, one onboarding approach. The more sophisticated, higher regulated employers in America certainly have teams to segregate it, but there's more contingent, there's more offsite employees than ever today. So we're urging employers to go back, and this is outside of even the background screening scope, go back and review those policies. Make sure you understand access. Make sure you understand data retention, data privacy. Make sure you understand simply the state or federal laws as it pertains to independent contractors acting as an employee and where those things kind of cross over. So if you have an independent contractor, and this is not legal advice, check with your own legal team and general counsel or outside counsel. But when you think about the boxes you have to check and say, does this person really apply as an independent contractor? Am I giving them a computer? How many hours a week are they working? Do they have people reporting to them? What access do they have to certain privileged information within the organization? These are criteria that we need to be aware of. And it's certainly outside of the purview of a background check. But these are things that we recommend to our customers when we see that they need help in actually developing their programs and making sure it's compliant. Now, as far as the background screening goes, again, we always go in and say, here's what our technology can do. It can keep it separate. You can have different views. You can have a contractor screening program that actually manages all your contractors and their candidates. If you have subs, as an example, that's a whole nother solution that we can offer. In fact, some of our largest clients are in the energy space, and anyone in energy, utilities, petrochemical understands it's a big deal to be able to manage these candidates. And in some cases, the candidates are short-lived, 2, 3, 4 months. And so there's a high volume, there's a high compliance requirement, and the technology and the legal layering of that within the the system is super important.
So the policy piece, it sounds like, is complicated. And then now let's talk about how, you've done all your analysis, you looked at your constituencies, you come up, you reviewed your policies, and then you actually got to do it. And here we found that 27% rated their technology as effective, which means 73% said not so good. And another 82% said they struggled with adoption challenges, which most of them can link back to the planning phases of getting the right people in the room to answer the questions and change the scale. So they literally, pretty much have said, the HR people who took part in our study, and it was a pretty big study, and we also did some external research with some of the other publishers that have researched this topic. What we found is most people feel their technology is not effective. And, that's not a quick fix. So what would you recommend to companies about how they either adopt their technology, or how do they qualify a provider such as GHRR to make sure that their provider has the agility to adapt to the changing compliance environment and has the technological infrastructure to meet the needs?
Yeah, I think when folks are saying 28% are saying we don't have the right technology, I think at the same time, Elliot, they're also saying, we don't handle change management very well, or we don't handle project management very well. We've seen some of the largest employers in America, some just pull it off like they just have it locked down. I mean, from procurement to timelines to process to the right people in the room. The bigger the organization, the more compliance requirements that there are, the more federal contracting or any sort of, other level considerations that they have to focus on, the more complex it can get. We've seen some of the biggest actually just not be very good at it, right? But what it comes down to is alignment and making sure that it's prioritized. And by I mean the actual project. If I'm going to market and I'm looking for a new contractor program, or I'm looking for a new pre-employment screening program, whether it be domestic or international, or in some cases a complex world might say, I need both. I have to make sure the right team is on that project team, that I have the right people driving it, that we have the bandwidth, the timeline to actually handle it. And the larger the employer, the more complex it can be. But we've even seen it in small employers. So it has to be something that's prioritized appropriately within the HR department. It has to be aligned with other factions within the organization, like compliance, legal, safety, and all the way through purchasing. And if that's done, it's prioritized, you have everyone on the same page, then that team can develop a request for proposal or information that's comprehensive. Some of our largest clients, I can tell you 100,000 employees or more, have pulled it off like a charm. But I'll tell you, when you get down to those finalist presentations, you're sitting in a room with 28 people. And there's 28 people or so in sophisticated organizations because they cover legal and compliance and purchasing and HR and talent acquisition across the board. And they're all focused on streamlining the process, making sure the technology is vetted, making sure the vendor is vetted, and making sure that everyone has a say in what that final decision is. If you're not approaching it in that type of structured way, again, whether you're Fortune 500 or you have 400 employees, we also see employers going and making a decision and it taking them literally up to a year to get that decision implemented when they only have 2,000 employees, is because it's not prioritized. They haven't done the homework and they haven't structured it appropriately. So that would be my recommendation. Pull back, make sure it's ready to go, make sure it's structured appropriately, and then hold yourself accountable to sticking to the timeline, the decision when selecting your new vendor.
And I would think that generally speaking, most HR people know, most of the listeners in our HR Today audience know that the penalties for non-compliance are dire and significant. That could be a career-ending injury for someone picking the wrong provider. But as a general rule, I'm sure you have a lot of material, collateral, facility in addressing here's our technology. But if you're an HR person and you're going out and talking to a couple of vendors at first blush, what are the warning signs they should look at from other providers? And I'm not asking you to badmouth competitors, but what are the warning signs where they need to say, okay, I asked this question and I think this answer is unacceptable as a potential provider? Are there patterns where you see some of the other players in the space? And there are some very big ones like GHR that are, they're established players and they've got the infrastructure, but there's also hundreds of small players, some of whom do not. How do they identify those and get them out, particularly if they're enterprise employers?
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a good question. And And it's something that, I've thought a lot about as I've really grown this company over a period of 18 years, looking at all sorts of technology offerings and how are we going to approach the market? How are we going to differentiate? And when you bring up the just hundreds of smaller providers, and I'm talking providers that are probably 15 million or below in revenue, call it maybe 80, 90 employees or less. The facts are there's been multiple stages of merger and acquisition activity in this industry. I'd say there's been 4 cycles of that, which means the top 3 or 4 players in this industry have gotten that way because they have a ton of capital influxed into the organization and they acquire. And by the way, we've done some of that too. With that comes the underinvestment with the technology. There's a couple firms in the industry, CRAs like Global HR Research, that have invested in technology, new technology, recent modern technology. And, I'd say there's only a couple of us within the last 5 years that have come to market with something new. That's our proprietary technology. So what I say to employers oftentimes is ask your prospective vendors, do they own their technology? Is it proprietary? Did they build it? Do they have their own developers? Or is it a third-party platform? And statistically speaking, there's probably 97% of all background screening providers in the industry are using what they call a third-party platform. And while that might be perfectly fine for a certain type of employer, generally speaking, there's an underinvestment there. There may be lacking some of the legal and compliance considerations that larger employers are going to be looking for. And when I talk about that, it really means sort of rules engines on the back end that are going to drive compliance. Things like authorizations and disclosure forms, state-specific forms that are required for a specific jurisdiction throughout the country. Does it have the capability to keep you compliant or help you stay compliant? That's a big, big question. And if the answer is no, we don't have those features within the solution, or yes, we are using a third-party system, you may be what I would say is sort of this kind of, I go from one vendor, one background screening provider to another and find out they're using the exact same technology. And the problem with that is you can't get efficiency. It's sort of this movement of provider A has exactly the same thing as provider B, and they're pitching me something different at a different price point, and it feels different, it sounds different, but at the end of the day, I have the same delays, I have customer service issues, I don't feel as compliant, I'm not getting the answers I want, and I certainly don't have the integrations I need to other HRIS or HMS solutions in the industry. So those are some basic questions you can ask and make sure that the answer is we are using our own teams to develop the software, we're maintaining the software, we have in-house counsel that can support us. These are all critical factors when choosing your screening provider.
And to be fair, and I'll say this to our studio audience, please be aware you're an enterprise company. You really need to be aware that there are some smaller providers out there that may claim to be able to perform the work, but they're really only a handful, maybe less than half a dozen, who you should trust with this kind of responsibility. And really, you're, sort of sharing the compliance risk with that provider. And that's another important aspect as to how they're willing to structure an agreement. All great advice about policy, about looking at treating the different areas of your workforce differently, and about how to qualify technologies. Brandon, thank you so much for taking part in the podcast. We're going to do this again. I think we're in September. We're going to talk about part 2 of this issue, which is, how do you get there, if you will, a little more insight into that. So thanks
Elliot, again.
Thank
you. And thanks to your subscribers. And, you guys have a class act team over there. And really, the folks that are engaged with HRO today are what I call the thought leaders in this industry, senior people doing senior things to make their organizations better. And, we look forward to continuing our partnership with you and your subscribers.
All right. Well, thanks. And to our listeners, thank you for your time and attention. And we look forward to having you join us on our next HRO Today educational podcast.